The acrid stench of burnt metal and plasma discharge still lingered in the air as Captain Mark Hayes holstered his pulse rifle, exhaling a tired breath. The village before him, nestled within the jagged cliffs of HFY, was in ruins, smoke curling from shattered structures. The bodies of fallen raiders sprawled in the dirt. The battle had been swift and brutal, but he had seen worse. He turned to survey the villagers, their wide, violet eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. The Keveran people were a slender, graceful species, their skin a shimmering hue of silver, their elongated fingers trembling as they clutched at each other for comfort. The moment the last raider had fallen, they had emerged from hiding, whispering in their melodic native tongue. Then, one among them stepped forward. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s by human standards, tall and willowy, with deep indigo markings running down her arms and across her forehead. Unlike the others, she was dressed in regal robes, tattered now from the chaos. Mark recognized her immediately. She had been the one trying to rally her people before the attack, her voice steady even as fear had flickered in her eyes. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow and gestured around. "You're safe now," he said, forcing a small smile. "I don't think they'll be coming back anytime soon." The young woman's gaze held his for a long moment, her silver irises gleaming with something unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she dropped to her knees before him, her head bowing low. Mark blinked. What are you doing?" The surrounding villagers immediately followed suit, their thin frames sinking to the dirt in eerie unison. A hushed reverence fell over them, as though they were in the presence of something divine. Mark felt a sudden discomfort creep up his spine. "Look, there's really no need for that," he said awkwardly, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "I was just passing through and figured I'd help." The young woman remained motionless for a moment before finally lifting her gaze. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "You misunderstand, Captain Hayes. This is not mere gratitude." Mark frowned. "Then what is it?" Her expression was resolute, her voice unwavering. "I am Araya, daughter of the Elder Council," she said, "and by the sacred laws of my people, I have sworn a life debt to you. From this day forth, I am bound to serve you until death." Mark's stomach dropped. "Wait, hold on a second," he said, raising his hands. That's not necessary. I mean, I appreciate it, really, but you don't owe me anything." Araya tilted her head, as if his words puzzled her. "You saved my people from destruction. In doing so, you have claimed my fealty. It is the way of my kind." Mark groaned inwardly. He had encountered dozens of alien cultures in his time as a freelance captain, but this was a first. "Look, you don't have to do this. I wasn't looking for a reward, and I certainly don't need a servant." Araya's silver eyes darkened slightly, but not with offense. Instead, there was a quiet determination there, something deep-seated and unshakable. "You misunderstand, Captain Hayes. I do not see myself as a servant. I see myself as your guardian." That took him off guard. "My what?" Araya rose to her feet, standing tall despite the exhaustion lining her delicate features. "I am no warrior," she admitted, glancing at the ruined village behind her. "I was meant to lead, but I failed. I could not protect my people." Her gaze returned to Mark's, a newfound fire within them. "But you fought when I could not. You did what I could not. If I stay, I will only lead them to ruin again. But if I follow you, perhaps I will learn what it means to be strong." Mark exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had a bad feeling about this. "Listen, Araya, I don't know what kind of ideas you've got about me, but I'm no noble warrior. I'm just a guy with a ship and a bad habit of getting into trouble. You don't want to be stuck with me." Araya didn't waver. "And yet, you saved us." "Yeah, well, that doesn't mean..." Before he could finish, an older Keveran man approached hesitantly, his voice trembling. "She speaks truth, Captain. The life debt is sacred. It cannot be broken." Mark let out a long, suffering sigh. "Of course it can't." Araya's expression softened slightly. "I do not ask for your permission, Captain Hayes. My decision is made." Mark looked around at the hopeful, expectant faces of the villagers. He was too tired for this. Fine, he muttered. But no bowing, okay? It makes me uncomfortable. A small smile ghosted across Araya's lips. As you wish, Captain. Mark had a sneaking suspicion that this was going to be a problem. A very big problem. Mark hadn't expected to leave Kevra 4 with a passenger. Yet, as the Starfire lifted off from the ruined village, Araya sat in the co-pilot's chair, her silver eyes watching him with an unsettling intensity. She had insisted on joining him, refusing to let him depart alone. As he navigated the ship through the planet's atmosphere, Mark finally broke the silence. You do realize this isn't some grand adventure, right? I don't have some noble quest for you to follow. Araya's gaze didn't waver. Then I shall follow you into whatever path fate deems necessary. Mark grunted. Fate's a fickle thing. If you haven't noticed, my life is mostly running from people who want me dead. Then I shall ensure you do not die, she said simply. Mark let out a dry chuckle. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? Araya nodded, as if it were an objective fact. So I have been told. Mark sighed. Fine. You're here now. But I don't need a bodyguard. Perhaps not. But I need a teacher. Mark shot her a wary look. A teacher? Araya straightened in her seat, her silver skin catching the glow of the control panels. I wish to learn what it means to fight, to protect, to lead. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. Great. Just what I needed. A student. Araya smiled. Indeed. Mark had a feeling this was going to be a long journey, and somehow, he doubted he was ready for it. Mark had taken on plenty of odd jobs in his time, smuggling, bounty hunting, even the occasional high-risk transport. But playing mentor to an alien noble who had arbitrarily decided to devote her life to him, that was new and inconvenient. The Starfire hummed as it drifted through the quiet black of space, its course set for the nearest trade hub. Mark leaned back in the pilot's chair, his boots propped up on the control panel, trying to ignore the unwavering gaze of his new passenger. Araya sat beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't said much since they left Kevra 4, but Mark could feel her eyes on him, studying him with that same silent intensity. Finally, he sighed. Look, if you're going to sit there staring at me like that, at least say something. She tilted her head. I was waiting for my first lesson. Mark frowned. Lesson? You agreed to teach me, she reminded him. I wish to understand strength, how to wield it, how to protect those who depend on me. Mark scoffed. I don't remember agreeing to anything. Araya's expression was patient, as if she expected this response. And yet, here we are. Mark shook his head, muttering something under his breath. He had dealt with persistent people before, but Araya had a quiet, unyielding way about her that made arguing feel pointless. All right, he said, dropping his feet to the floor. Fine. Lesson 1. Strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Araya considered his words. Then how does one determine when to fight? Mark exhaled, running a hand through his short brown hair. You fight when you have no other choice. When walking away means losing something or someone, you can't afford to lose. Araya was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. Then I will fight for you, Captain Hayes, for as long as I live. Mark blinked. That's not really the point I was trying to make. But Araya simply sat back, satisfied. Mark groaned. He was beginning to realize that teaching this girl was going to be a lot harder than he thought. The trade station on Velrose 9 was a grimy, lawless pit floating in the outer reaches of the Andronis sector. It was the kind of place where deals were made in dark corners, where pirates and mercenaries rubbed shoulders with desperate merchants, and where a man like Mark could pick up supplies without too many questions asked. Mark led the way through the station's bustling market, Araya following closely behind. She moved with an elegance that made her stand out, her silver skin and deep indigo markings drawing more than a few curious looks. You ever been off-world before? Mark asked over his shoulder. Araya shook her head. No. My duty has always been to my people. Then here's another lesson for you, Mark said, lowering his voice. Places like this? They'll chew you up and spit you out if you let them. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact and He turned to find Araya staring straight at a group of heavily armed mercenaries lounging outside a weapons shop. "And don't do that," he sighed. One of the mercenaries, a broad-shouldered brute with cybernetic implants along his jaw, noticed her staring and sneered. "Something you like, sweetheart?" he drawled, stepping closer. Araya didn't flinch. "I was merely observing." The mercenary chuckled darkly. "That's so? Pretty little thing like you ought to be careful where she stares. Might give people the wrong idea." Mark stepped between them before things could escalate. "We're not looking for trouble." The mercenary smirked. "You found it anyway." Mark saw the punch coming before it was even thrown. He ducked, driving an elbow into the guy's gut before twisting his arm into a lock. The mercenary grunted in pain, but Mark didn't let go. "Lesson 2, Mark muttered. Never start a fight you can't win." Araya watched, unmoving, as Mark released the mercenary with a shove. The man staggered back, clutching his arm, before deciding that it wasn't worth the trouble. He spat on the ground and stalked off, his friends following. Mark exhaled. "And that's how you handle." Before he could finish, Araya moved. Fast, with a graceful precision that caught even Mark off guard, she stepped forward, grabbed a discarded metal rod from the ground, and in one smooth motion, swung it into the back of the mercenary's knee. The man crumpled with a strangled yell. Mark swore under his breath. What the hell was that? Araya turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You said strength is knowing when to fight." "Yeah, and that fight was already over." Araya frowned. "He insulted you, threatened you. That was unacceptable." Mark rubbed his temples. "Okay, new rule. Maybe don't start crippling people in the middle of a marketplace." Araya seemed to consider this before nodding. "Understood." Mark sighed, motioning for her to follow. "Let's just get what we came for before we end up on someone's hit list." As they moved through the market, Mark glanced at Araya from the corner of his eye. She had acted without hesitation, without fear. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or a very, very bad one. They found out about the bounty while leaving the station. Mark had just finished loading supplies onto the Starfire when Araya, standing nearby, suddenly tensed. "Captain," she said quietly. Mark followed her gaze to a nearby bounty board. His face was plastered across the hollow screen, a list of charges scrolling beneath it. "Wanted, Captain Mark Hayes. Reward, 50,000 credits, alive only." Mark cursed under his breath. "That is a large sum," Araya observed. "Yeah, no kidding." Mark was already moving, his mind racing. 50,000 credits was enough to make every lowlife in the sector take notice. And worse, a voice from behind them sent a chill down his spine. "Captain Hayes." Mark turned slowly. Four men stood at the entrance to the docking bay, weapons drawn. "Bounty's good whether you come quiet or not," one of them said. "Your choice." Mark glanced at Araya. Her silver eyes gleamed, her hands tightening into fists. He had a feeling she wasn't planning to let him be taken without a fight. Mark exhaled. "Well, Araya, looks like it's time for your next lesson." Her lips curled into a small smile. "I am ready." Mark drew his pistol. "Then let's get to work." Mark didn't wait for the bounty hunters to make the first move. He knew how these things played out. Hesitation got you killed. He fired first. A bright bolt of plasma shot from his pistol, slamming into the shoulder of the nearest bounty hunter. The man let out a strangled curse as he staggered back, his weapon clattering to the floor. The others reacted immediately, fanning out, weapons raised. Mark dove behind a cargo crate, pulling Araya down with him. Blaster fire exploded around them, scorching metal and sending sparks into the air. "All right," Mark muttered, pressing his back against the crate. "Lesson 3, cover is your best friend." And before he could finish, Araya moved. She didn't hesitate, didn't even flinch at the chaos around her. In one fluid motion, she lunged over the crate, closing the distance between her and the bounty hunters with a speed that caught them off guard. Mark barely had time to swear before she struck. The closest bounty hunter, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, had no chance to react. Araya grabbed his wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing to the ground with a sharp, precise motion. The next bounty hunter swung the butt of his rifle at her head, but she ducked, her silver skin gleaming under the station's dim lights. Then she struck back. Her elbow connected with the man's ribs, followed by a sharp kick to the knee. He collapsed with a pained grunt. Mark stared. Well, damn, he muttered. He had known Araya wanted to learn how to fight. He had assumed she would need training, guidance. But she was moving like she had done this before. Not with the reckless aggression of a soldier, but with the precision of someone who had studied every move, every opening. She wasn't just strong. She was dangerous. Mark snapped out of his daze just in time to duck another shot. He returned fire, catching the last standing bounty hunter in the leg. The man crumpled, groaning in pain. Silence fell over the docking bay. Mark exhaled, stepping over the bodies. Okay, that was something. Araya stood among the fallen, her silver eyes scanning the unconscious bounty hunters. They were slow, she said simply. Mark raised an eyebrow. Yeah, well, most people don't go charging into a gunfight either. Araya turned to him, tilting her head. Should I not have done that? Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't sure what to say. You took down 2 armed men in under 10 seconds, he said finally. Where the hell did you learn to fight like that? Araya hesitated. I have studied combat. My people do not practice violence, but I have always believed knowledge of battle is necessary. Mark folded his arms. So you've trained before? Not with weapons, she admitted. Only with strategy. I have observed, analyzed. But this was the first time I have applied it. Mark let out a low whistle. First time, huh? Remind me not to get on your bad side. Araya simply nodded, as if that were a reasonable statement. Mark sighed. All right, well, congratulations. You just made us a much bigger problem. He gestured at the unconscious bounty hunters. These guys aren't going to stay down forever. We need to move. Now. He grabbed a nearby crate, shoving it aside to reveal a hidden compartment on the Starfire's hull. He keyed in a code, and the ship's side hatch slid open. Araya followed without question. As they climbed aboard, Mark spared one last glance at the bounty hunters sprawled across the docking bay. 50,000 credits. Someone really wanted him alive. And that meant they weren't done. Not by a long shot. The Starfire jumped into hyperspace, leaving Velros, 9 behind in a blur of blue light. Mark slumped into the pilot's seat, rubbing his temples. Well, that went to hell fast. Araya settled into the co-pilot's chair. We survived. Mark gave her a dry look. Yeah, that's the bare minimum of success, kid. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him carefully. This bounty. It is not the first time someone has placed a price on your life, is it? Mark chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Not even close. Who is hunting you? Take your pick, Mark muttered. Pirates, mercenaries, crime syndicates, corrupt officials. I've made a lot of enemies over the years. Araya frowned slightly. And yet, you fight for others. You save my people. Mark sighed, leaning back. I don't go looking for trouble, Araya. It just finds me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I do not believe that. Mark shot her a look. Oh, you saw injustice and acted, she said simply. That is not something troublemakers do. That is something protectors do. Mark scoffed. I'm no protector. Araya didn't argue, but the look in her silver eyes told him she disagreed. Mark shook his head, changing the subject. We need to figure out who put that bounty on me. 50,000 credits is enough to get the wrong kind of people interested. Araya nodded. Where do we start? Mark exhaled, pulling up the Starfire's navigation system. A dozen red-marked locations blinked across the screen. Places where he had unfinished business, enemies left behind. Finally, he selected a name. Kreska, 4. A backwater moon controlled by a powerful crime lord named Veskerdron. If anyone knew who was gunning for Mark, it would be him. Set course for Kreska, 4, he muttered. Araya pressed a few keys, locking in the destination. As the ship altered course, Mark felt a strange sense of inevitability settle over him. He had spent years running from his past, from his enemies. Now, with Araya by his side, it felt like he was finally turning to face them. The Starfire touched down on Kreska. 4 with a hiss of steam, its landing gear kicking up dust from the barren moon surface. The settlement ahead was a collection of crude metal structures, neon signs flickering in the toxic air. Mark adjusted the blaster at his hip and turned to Araya. All right. Rule number 1 on Kreska, 4, trust no one. She nodded. Understood. Mark exhaled. I mean it. This place is full of backstabbers and lowlifes. If anyone asks, you're my bodyguard. Araya raised an eyebrow. Am I not already? Mark hesitated. Fair point. They stepped off the ramp and into the settlement. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of rusted metal. Eyes followed them from the shadows. At the center of the settlement, a towering structure loomed, the headquarters of Vesker Drawn. Mark squared his shoulders. If anyone had answers, it was Vesker. The only problem? Mark wasn't sure if he'd be walking out of there alive. Kreska 4's atmosphere was thick with smog, a mixture of industrial waste and decades-old neglect. The settlement around them was little more than a collection of rusted prefab buildings, illuminated by the eerie glow of neon signs flickering in alien languages. Mark had been here before, and he hated it every time. As he and Araya walked through the main thoroughfare, he could feel the eyes on them. Cutthroats, mercenaries, slavers. Kreska 4 was the kind of place where a man with a 50,000 credit bounty wouldn't last long, which was why he needed to move fast. Vesker Drawn ran this cesspit, and if there were whispers about who had placed the price on Mark's head, they would have passed through his ears first. Araya walked beside him with an effortless grace, her silver skin gleaming under the dim lights. She did not cower, did not hesitate. If she felt the weight of the stairs around her, she showed no sign of it. You're handling this place pretty well, Mark muttered, keeping his hand near his blaster. I have seen fear before, Araya replied. This place is built upon it, but I do not fear them. Mark smirked. Good. Just don't let your guard down. They reached a towering structure at the heart of the settlement, a massive, rusted tower of interlocking scrap metal and salvaged ship parts. Vesker Drawn's headquarters. 2 heavily armed guards stood outside the entrance, their eyes narrowing as Mark approached. Captain Hayes, one of them rasped, a reptilian alien with yellow, slitted eyes. You got a death wish showing your face here? Mark sighed. Look, I just need to talk to Vesker. That's all. The second guard, a burly human with cybernetic arms, let out a low chuckle. You've got half the sector looking for your head. You think Vesker's gonna let you waltz in for a friendly chat? Mark shrugged. Tell him I've got a counteroffer for whoever put the bounty on me. He'll want to hear it. The guards exchanged a glance. Then, without a word, the reptilian one pressed a button on his wrist. A moment later, the large metal doors groaned open, revealing a dimly lit corridor leading into the depths of the tower. Move, the cybernetic guard grunted. Mark exhaled and stepped forward. Araya followed without hesitation. You know, Mark muttered, this could go very badly. Araya merely placed a hand on the hilt of the curved blade she had taken from Velrose, 9. Then we will simply ensure it does not. Mark chuckled despite himself. You make it sound so easy. It is, she said simply. Mark wasn't sure if that was confidence or naivety. Either way, there was no turning back now. The interior of Vesker's tower was exactly as Mark remembered, dark, suffocating, and filled with the stench of corruption. The guards led them through a winding series of corridors until they reached a massive chamber at the center of the complex. Vesker Drawn sat upon a throne of salvaged ship parts, his thick, reptilian body draped in expensive fabrics. His scales were deep crimson, his yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light. A series of cybernetic implants ran along his arms and neck, pulsating with faint blue energy. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed enforcers. Mark forced a grin. Vesker, you're looking well. The crime lord let out a low, rumbling laugh. Captain Hayes, you must be truly desperate to step into my den. Mark spread his hands. Let's just say I prefer to deal with my problems head-on. Vesker leaned forward, his claws drumming against the metal armrest of his throne. A smart man would have stayed in the shadows. But you? You march right to my doorstep. Either you have a death wish, or you think you have something I want. Mark crossed his arms. 50,000 credit bounty. Alive only. Someone out there wants me bad. I need to know who. Vesker bared his sharp teeth in a grin. And what makes you think I'll just hand that information over? Mark smirked. Because I know you, Vesker. You're a businessman. And if someone is willing to pay 50 grand for me, maybe I can make you a better offer. Vesker tilted his head. Intriguing. And what exactly do you have to bargain with? Mark hesitated. He had nothing. No credits, no leverage. Just the slim hope that Vesker's greed would outweigh his loyalty. Before he could come up with an answer, Araya stepped forward. I will fight for you, she said calmly. Mark's stomach dropped. What? Vesker's eyes gleamed with amusement. Oh? And what exactly does that mean? Araya met his gaze without fear. You command many warriors. I will be your champion. In exchange, you will tell Captain Hayes what he wishes to know. Mark clenched his jaw. Araya, this isn't. She raised a hand, silencing him. Vesker studied her for a long moment. Then he let out a deep, rumbling laugh. A bold offer. But why would I trust you? Araya's silver eyes did not waver. Because I do not break my oaths. Vesker's grin widened. Very well. If you win, I will tell Hayes what he wants to know. If you lose, he chuckled. Then I will have gained a new pet. Mark's blood ran cold. Araya, this is a bad idea. She turned to him, her expression serene. It is my choice, Captain Hayes. You have taught me much. Now let me prove I have learned. Mark swore under his breath. He had walked into this thinking he could talk his way out. Now, Araya had turned it into a fight. And Mark had no idea if she could win. The arena was an underground pit beneath Vesker's throne room, surrounded by rusted metal walls and flickering lights. The crowd above roared with anticipation, betting credits exchanging hands as they eyed the upcoming fight. Mark stood at the edge of the pit, his stomach twisted in knots. Araya stood in the center, calm as ever. Her opponent was a towering brute, half machine, half flesh, standing nearly 7 feet tall. A cybernetic monstrosity built for war. Mark leaned toward her. Araya, listen to me. That thing is a killing machine. This isn't a strategy lesson. This is survival. Araya nodded. Then I shall survive. Mark wanted to believe her. The fight began with a thunderous clang as the brute charged. Araya moved like liquid silver, dodging the first strike with effortless grace. The cybernetic warrior swung again, but she ducked, rolling beneath his arm. Then, she struck. A precise hit to the back of the knee. A second strike to the ribs. Fast, efficient, calculated. The brute staggered, but he did not fall. Instead, he roared, swinging wildly. Araya barely avoided the next blow, but Mark could see it. Her movements were slowing. The sheer force of her opponent was overwhelming her. Damn it, Mark muttered. She needed an opening. She needed something. Then he saw it. The brute's cybernetic implants pulsed with energy. A power source. A weak spot. Araya! Mark shouted. Aim for the implants, right shoulder. Without hesitation, she adjusted. She leapt, driving her blade into the weak spot. The brute howled. Sparks erupted from his shoulder, his body spasming. And then, with a final, elegant motion, Araya finished it. The brute collapsed. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Then, they erupted into cheers. Mark exhaled, heart pounding. Araya turned to Vesker. I have one. Now keep your word. Vesker grinned. Oh, Captain Hayes, he chuckled. You're going to love what I have to tell you. Vesker drawn leaned forward, his yellow eyes gleaming with amusement. The crowd around the arena still buzzed with excitement, voices raised in disbelief at the silver-skinned girl who had just taken down a cybernetic brute with nothing but speed and precision. But Mark wasn't paying attention to them. His focus was on Vesker. You said you'd give me a name, Mark said, his voice tight. So let's hear it. Vesker chuckled, rising from his throne of scrap metal. Patience, Captain. You truly are an impatient man. Mark clenched his jaw. Don't push me, Vesker. The crime lord let out another low laugh before finally gesturing to one of his guards. The reptilian enforcer tapped a few keys on a datapad, and a holographic image flickered to life in front of them. Mark's stomach dropped the moment he saw the face. A woman, human, with piercing emerald eyes and short, raven black hair. She wore a high-ranking officer's uniform, the insignia of the Sovereign Consortium, the largest and most ruthless military faction in the sector, glinting on her chest. Captain Elise Voss. Mark exhaled sharply. Damn it. You know her, Araya observed, her silver eyes narrowing. Mark nodded grimly. Yeah, I know her. Vesker grinned, clearly enjoying himself. Not just know her, Captain. She used to be your commanding officer, didn't she? Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elise Voss was a name he had hoped never to hear again. She had been his superior when he was still with the Consortium. Back when he was a soldier. Back before he'd turned his back on them and run. And now, she was hunting him. Araya turned to him. Why does she seek you? Mark hesitated. Then he sighed. Because I know things. Things the Consortium doesn't want getting out. And if Elise Voss has put a bounty on me, it means she's getting desperate to shut me up. Vesker chuckled. I'd say that makes you a very valuable man, Captain Hayes. To the right buyer, of course. Mark's hand drifted toward his blaster. Don't even think about it, Vesker. The crime lord grinned, raising his hands in mock surrender. Relax, Captain. You earned your information. I'm merely entertaining possibilities. Mark exhaled. Yeah, well, entertain them quietly. We're leaving. He turned to Araya. Let's go. Without hesitation, she followed. As they strode through the corridors of Vesker's tower, Mark's mind raced. Elise Voss. She was the one pulling the strings. And that meant this bounty was only the beginning. The Starfire launched from Kreska. 4 engines roaring as it broke through the moon's toxic atmosphere and into open space. Mark sat in the pilot's seat, hands gripping the controls tighter than necessary. You are troubled, Araya said, seated beside him. Mark exhaled. Yeah, you could say that. You fear this woman. Mark hesitated, then shook his head. No, I don't fear her, but I know what she's capable of. Elise Voss isn't the kind of person who gives up. If she's after me, she'll keep coming until one of us is dead. Araya considered this. Then we must strike first. Mark turned to her, raising an eyebrow. That's a hell of a suggestion, coming from someone who supposedly doesn't believe in violence. Araya met his gaze evenly. I believe in balance. In necessity. She will not stop. Therefore, we must end this before she does. Mark chuckled dryly. You're starting to sound like a soldier. You know that? Araya didn't respond. Mark leaned back, rubbing a hand down his face. All right, you're not wrong. We can't run forever. He glanced at the navigation system. There was only one place to go. The Typhon Expanse. A stretch of lawless space where even the Consortium had little control. A place where old enemies and forgotten ghosts lingered. Mark had allies there. People who owed him favors. If he was going to fight back, he'd need all the help he could get. He punched in the coordinates. Hold on, he muttered. This is going to get messy. Araya simply nodded, her silver eyes calm. The Starfire shot into hyperspace. The hunt was over. Now, the war would begin. The Typhon Expanse was as chaotic as Mark remembered. A lawless frontier of derelict stations, outlaw fleets, and pirate strongholds. It was the perfect place for a final stand. The Starfire docked at an old, half-functioning station called Deadrock, one of the last independent outposts in the sector. A place where people with nowhere else to go gathered. Mark stepped off the ship, Araya close behind. They weren't alone. The moment they entered the station's main hall, a group of figures stepped forward. Some were bounty hunters. Some were old allies. Some were old enemies. And at the center of them all stood Elise Voss. She looked exactly as Mark remembered. Sharp, ruthless, utterly composed. Her emerald eyes locked onto his, and she smiled. Mark, she said smoothly, it's been a long time. Mark exhaled, fingers twitching toward his blaster. Not long enough. Elise tilted her head. You didn't really think you could run forever, did you? Mark smirked. No, but I had to try. Elise chuckled. You always were stubborn. Then her expression hardened. But it ends here. The bounty hunters around her raised their weapons. Mark's heart pounded. He glanced at Araya, who was already moving, her hand on her blade, her silver eyes alight with purpose. Mark sighed. Well, he muttered, guess we're doing this the hard way. And then the shooting started. When the dust settled, the station was in ruins. Fires burned. Bodies littered the floor. Mark stood over Elise Voss, his blaster smoking. She coughed, blood trickling from her lips, but she still smiled. You think this changes anything? Mark exhaled. No, but it's a damn good start. Elise's breath rattled. Then, finally, she went still. Mark holstered his weapon, turning to Araya. She stood amidst the wreckage, her silver skin streaked with blood, not her own. You all right? Mark asked. She met his gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. You were right, she murmured. Strength is knowing when to fight. Mark nodded. And when to walk away, he added. She was silent for a moment. Then she bowed her head slightly, not in submission, not in servitude, but in acknowledgement. Where do we go now? She asked. Mark looked out at the stars. Anywhere we want. And together, they stepped into the unknown.